Scripture reading this morning is from Matthew chapter 25, 1 through 12, the parable of the 10 virgins. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps but did not take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight the cry rang out, "Here's the bridegroom, come out and meet him." Then all the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, our lamps are going out." "No," they replied, "there may not be enough for both us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." But while they were on their way to buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later the others also came. "Lord, Lord," they said, "open the door for us." But he replied, "Truly I tell you, I don't know you. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour."
When I say the words wedding drama, I bet some of you are already squirming in your seats. Wedding drama. If we could go to that first slide, that's become kind of a popular modern phrase, hasn't it? The bridezilla, we might call her. Sometimes when you think about the event of a wedding, you're dealing sometimes with what has been this little girl's fairy tale dream from the time she was just tiny and could start thinking about it. We've thought about details, we've thought about music, we've thought about decorations and food and wanting everything to go exactly the way that we've imagined it. And of course, inevitably, something doesn't go according to plan, and sometimes people get very tense. And I know it's also a bit unfair for us just to talk about the bridezilla, quote unquote, because let's be honest, there's a lot more family involved in this than just the bride, right? You've also got the groom, who may or may not have been very supportive in the process, may or may not have done some of the things he was asked to do. There's all the personalities of his family and her family trying to blend those things together, and one person might want this, another person wants something else, and just in general, weddings can be very stressful in a lot of different ways. And then there's also the unexpected things that happen. I'm remembering when I was a child, I guess I was 5 or 7 years old, at one of my relatives' weddings, and the preacher started going on and on and on, and one of the groomsmen had his knees locked and just flat passed out in the middle of the wedding and fell over. You may have seen that happen before. I wasn't there for my parents' wedding, but apparently when my mother was standing there next to my father, she got a little too close to one of the candles there at the church, and everyone talks about this huge puff of smoke and fire where her veil was suddenly gone. Fortunately, she was oblivious to the whole thing and didn't get hurt, but that one moment in my parents' wedding that everyone talked about was this, and right there around my mother's head. But those unexpected things happen. I had it in mind as I began this sermon, I was going to look up online some funny stories of things that have happened at weddings, but I've got to tell you, if you start Googling like wedding mishaps, most of them are so awful, I would just hate to repeat them. I mean, all this stuff, when people get really drunk and they start fighting and there's cheating and runaway brides and, wedding drama is a real thing. And when we look at this parable that we're studying this morning, we see that wedding drama is not just a recent problem. There has always been a lot of expectation around weddings. They have been very significant in the lives of the people involved, certainly, but also in the life of the community. There's a lot of easy tension that can arise in conjunction with a wedding. And so this parable lets us know that we're not the first generation to ever think about or deal with wedding drama. When you think about ancient wedding practices, Most often in Jesus' culture, they would have been prearranged, something that two families got together and decided that they had a son and another had a daughter, and they were going to help the two become one. Very often, the groom's family would pay some kind of a dowry to the bride's family, because in the mind of this culture, that family was losing a daughter, someone who'd be there to help out in the house and work. Well, they're losing one of their workers, so they would pay a pretty hefty bride price in order to marry that daughter to their son. And when that arrangement got made, usually there would be something like a coin. You know, we have engagement rings. They didn't really have engagement rings, but there'd be a coin or something of pretty good value that would be given to the bride that was truly hers to keep as a little token that this was a sealed deal. And even though they were just betrothed at that point, everyone proceeded as if they were already married, aside from them, living together and being together. And so when the time came, the groom's party would make their way over to the bride's house to retrieve her. And it was pretty nice. Grooms were exempted from military duty and some other kinds of things while they were betrothed. But there was a lot about this occasion that would involve the element of surprise. And so typically they would wait until the evening, and there's also some pragmatic reasons for waiting until the evening. If you've got household servants, if you've got people working during the day, weddings were usually, feasts that would last for about a week, lots of different events on different days, but there for the first night of the celebrating, they wanted to make sure everybody could finish up their chores for the day and get off of work so everyone could be present. And the groom would try to come at some surprising time to show up and pick up the bride. And that's where the special role of these young virgins came into play. Kind of like our modern bridesmaids, they were there to be supportive of the event. Depending on your translation, I think most translations would say that these virgins were holding on to 10 lamps. But in Greek, there's a couple of different words we can use for this. There's a word that gets used several times in Jesus' teaching that seems to be talking about more of a household lamp. So when you think of Aladdin's lamp, one of those metal ones that would sit on a table, that's one kind of lamp. But the word used in this story, we think would probably be a torch rather than a lamp, some kind of a nighttime torch. What they would have with them would be the torch itself. You'd have some kind of cloth that you'd be wrapping around the end of it, and then you'd have a jar of oil you would have to use to keep the torch lit. It was important to have that extra oil because running out of oil when you were a torch bearer was about like having a flashlight with no batteries in it. I mean, if there's no oil for the torch, there's no way that this is going to work. And so there would be this surprising moment where the groom's party shows up, and kind of like the way we do surprise parties, everyone would just start shouting, "He's here, he's here, he's here." And in all the excitement, they had to be ready to go at any time. Whenever the groom showed up, their job was to make sure their torches were ready so that they could light the way back to the groom's house where the party would begin. For us, we are used to having street lamps and headlights on our cars and those kinds of things, but it wasn't just some kind of symbolic purpose for these lamps. They really needed those torches burning so that the party could see the way in the road to where it was they were going. So it was a custom, but it was also a necessity that they could have light for their path as they traveled. So how embarrassing it would have been for this wedding Jesus is talking about, where the groom shows up and fully half of those girls didn't have their torches burning and ready to go. As we talk about this parable, most elements of this parable would be considered completely normal. These are all regular elements you would expect to see in a wedding of this time period. There's nothing about this story. I mean, it's a sad story, it's an unfortunate story, but it's not an unheard of story until you get to the very last part of the story when those virgins, the foolish virgins who had been unprepared, went and started knocking on the door of the groom's family, saying to the master of the household, let us in, we're supposed to be here." And he gives that odd response, "No, you can't come in, and I never knew you. I don't know who you are." They're told to stay on the outside. When we're talking about the parables, it's often the unexpected element that should teach us something. And I would say in this parable, it's that unexpected element, that refusal of entry there at the end, that we probably need to pay the most attention to. Because this was the part of the story that none of them would have seen coming. They'd all feel sympathy for the bride and the groom, for those girls to have not been prepared. But this twisted element where all of a sudden the master refuses them entrance raises for us a different question. When Christ comes back to call his church home, will we be found ready to go? That's the driving question, isn't it? When Christ comes back to call us home, will he find us prepared for him, ready to go when it's time for us to go home with him again? What I'd like to do this morning, there's several different ways we can go with this story, so I'm going to highlight some different concepts that I think become significant in light of this story. One of these ideas is the word delay. When you think about what it means to have a delay. Something that this parable teaches us is that even though we're all expecting one day Jesus is going to return, we're all expecting that day of judgment, and we know it's coming, it's highly possible that it's going to take a lot longer than we thought it was going to. Just the way that those wedding parties would wait for the groom, and you wait for the groom, he could come at any time, but he could wait a really long time before he did it. In terms of Christ's return, there's going to be delay involved. We don't know exactly the day or the hour. This is kind of a side study, but if you were to go home today and read through the books of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, you see this principle in play in these two letters. In 1 Thessalonians, Paul says a lot of beautiful things about the coming day of the Lord and what it's going to be like when Christ returns, and we're going to be called up to meet him, and there's going to be all this amazing stuff that happens, kind of like what we were singing about earlier, and we were singing it as well with my soul. A lot of those ideas show up in 1 Thessalonians. But it seems that what started happening in that town of Thessalonica is that they got so caught up in waiting for Jesus to come back, they really thought he was going to come any minute now. And so a lot of them, it seems, had kind of stopped working. They'd quit their jobs, and it's like they were just kind of out on a hill somewhere waiting for Jesus to come and get them. And so when you read 1 Thessalonians and then you read 2 Thessalonians, in 2 Thessalonians, Paul is offering the corrective to that mentality. This is where Paul says things like, if a person isn't willing to work, they shouldn't eat. Paul says, we're all waiting for Jesus. We know it could be any time, but it's going to be on his own time. And so until then, we've got to keep being ready. We've got to keep working. There are going to be delays. God may delay in coming much longer than we were expecting. And as we think about some of the other parables we've been talking about, I would remind us of the wheat and the tares. On the one hand, God could have sent in his servants just to start cleaning the field of all the weeds, but the master of the field says, let's go ahead and wait because we don't want to damage anything. We want to give more time that good fruit can be produced. God is very patient with us, wanting to make sure that a full crop is ready for harvest. But we're reminded of the importance of our understanding delay, that there will be delay, perhaps a long delay in the coming of Christ. Another word that I think we need to think about is the word awareness. The word awareness. Back in 2005, there's a guy named David Foster Wallace who gave a very famous commencement address, and the part that people latched onto the most was the first couple of minutes where he told a story about some fish. He said there are two young fish that are swimming along one day, and then an older fish swims by them and says to them, "Good morning, boys, how's the water?" And they kind of smiled and they kept swimming, and they got a little ways further and neither of them had said anything. And finally, one looks at the other and says, "What in the world is water?" Think about that. That was the question. What's water? One fish asks the other. When you say, when you're swimming in something all the time, when you're surrounded in something all the time, you can actually become blind to its presence. We're challenged as Christians to always be aware of the reality that we're living in. The truth is, we may be waiting a long time for Jesus to come back. It may not occur within our lifetime. It may be in the lifetimes of our great-great-great-great-grandchildren. We really have no idea, but our challenge, just the same, is to be aware of the reality of God. That we're living in a world that God created. And I really believe that God is around us all the time. James says that all good gifts come from God. All good things come from God. I really trust and believe that the fact that we're breathing right now and talking, and you were able to walk in here this morning and we're worshiping together and no one is attacking us or harming us, these are all things that are gifts from God. We're surrounded with the love of God. We can so easily become blind to it. And many around us truly are so blind to it that they would even ask that question, how could there be a God? I can't imagine how there's a God. Where is God? But we stay aware of that reality that God is with us and around us all the time. Awareness is important for us as Christians. But then there's that other word, preparation. Preparation. This parable is just dripping with the importance of preparation, isn't it? being prepared for things. There's a really hard teaching in this parable for us to contemplate. Namely, for those who masquerade as the people of God, there is going to be an irreversible judgment. I mean, that's the call, isn't it? There were some who were invited to be part of the wedding party and masqueraded as if they were part of the wedding party, but when the bridegroom arrived, they were unprepared and they weren't part of the celebration. Those who are unprepared to meet God, the harsh reality is there is a point coming, there is going to be a point in time where we no longer have an opportunity to make preparations. Very urgent that we do that while we can. I think this passage highlights for us a couple of different qualities of God that are both very important, that both of which we need to uphold at all times. Those two qualities are God's love, His unconditional love, but also His unconditional holiness. God's love and God's holiness. You know, we look at this story about those five foolish girls, and there's a big part of us that kind of reads it and wishes that the love of God would just override the importance of their obedience. Is it really necessary that they got excluded from the wedding celebration? I mean, they were a little late. Come on, couldn't the love of God just kind of ride over everything and turn a blind eye to the things that these girls had neglected? But we're reminded many places in Scripture that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. A healthy respect for God, a healthy respect for God's expectations of us, these are the first steps in becoming a wise person who lives a good life. Now, for us, this sounds like kind of a harsh story because I don't think any of us has ever been a torchbearer at a wedding, right? For us, this is a strange thing. I read that story and say, well, how was I supposed to know how much oil I needed? Or how was I supposed to know if my torch wasn't long enough? I mean, I could easily mess that job up. But let's remember that in this story, in this culture, we're talking about people who absolutely knew how to do this. This was something that would have been done at every wedding that ever occurred. This was something that was normal, that was expected. What they were asked to do was not burdensome to them. In fact, it was an honor to them to be included as part of this wedding celebration. Those girls failed to take responsibility for one of the most fundamental and obvious tasks of wedding preparation. This was like knowing you had invited 100 people and baking a cake for 20. They knew what they should have been doing. These girls were clear on what their responsibilities were. Notice also that once they realized they were unprepared, rather than just take responsibility for themselves, they tried to take something away from those who were prepared. Those other girls who had done what they should have done, who brought the supplies that they needed, they were content to take away from them so that those girls also would run out rather than be able to complete the task. Effectively, they're trying to bring those other girls down to their own level. And having failed to be prepared, not hurrying out and getting the supplies they needed, they ended up totally skipping out on their job. That evening, the groom and his new bride had to walk home with half of the life that they were supposed to have because of those who didn't do the things they had been invited to do. Again, all of these things highlight the nature of God's love, but also His holiness. It's God's love that drove Him to invite us all to the party. That He wants all of us to be part of this wedding between Christ and His bride, the church. He wants all of us to be included. It's His love that invites us. It's His love that makes it possible for us. But it's also the love of God that takes seriously the consequences of sin. That God couldn't look at the sin in the world and just look the other way because He knew that what sin was going to produce was death. God loved us enough to tell us the truth through Jesus Christ, through the Gospels, through the other inspired writers. God has loved us, and because He's loved us, He's warned us about the things we've got to be prepared for. The love of God is abundant, but so is the holiness of God. It is the holiness of God that demands if we're going to accept His invitation and become a Christian, we've got to conduct our lives in ways that bring honor to the sacrifice of Christ. It's the holiness of God that demands we really show the passion for Christ that we should, that He's not going to be contented with our lukewarmness, where we say one thing and do another, where we only give Him half-heartedness. The holiness of God expects more out of us. The holiness of God is not going to allow us merely to masquerade as Christians while living selfishly all of our lives. The holiness of God demands that once we made that vow in our baptism, we do the best we can to uphold that vow and to honor God in the things that we're doing. So we remember this idea of delay, that there will be a long delay, perhaps longer than we expected, for Christ to return. We remember the importance of awareness, that we're aware of the reality of what's going on, and therefore we make preparations so that we can meet Christ when He returns. And all of these ideas drive us, I think, towards the concept of vigilance. To be vigilant, standing prepared, knowing who it is that you are, living clearly in light of these things that you understand. You know, vigilance means choosing courage over fear. Because we know what matters most, I'm going to do the thing that's right, even when someone tries to intimidate me out of it. Being vigilant means showing courage. Being vigilant means showing conviction over intimidation, that we are going to do the right thing regardless. Being vigilant also means choosing the right actions, not only for my sake, but also for the sake of future generations. If I'm vigilant, I'm going to keep putting God first. I'm going to keep speaking the truth about God, because the next generation also needs to know the truth, needs to know the clearer path. Being vigilant means I'm not going to just be complacent and let the world wash us away into whatever the world is thinking about. Being vigilant means standing firm, choosing what I'm going to do, who I'm going to be, and communicating that for the next generation. I was trying to think about how to help us apply these ideas, and I came across these two questions that I think are more profound than we give them credit for. The two questions are, where are you and what time is it? Think about this. Where are you and what time is it? You can answer that question in several different ways, right? On the surface level, right now you might say, I'm at King's Crossing and I'm at church, and right now it looks like it's just about half past the hour, so Mark needs to wrap it up, right? You can think about where you are and what time it is. But there's a deeper way that we can answer those questions. I heard one person say that if we want to live a life of awareness, if we want to live a life that's prepared for Christ to return, as often as possible, we should have only one correct answer to either of those questions. Namely, where are you? I'm here. And what time is it? It's now. It's easy for us to always be somewhere, but to be living somewhere else some other time in our heads. Even though I'm here right now, I'm thinking about lunch. Even though I'm here right now, I'm thinking about this stuff I've got to deal with at the office next week. Even though I'm here right now, I'm still dealing with baggage that's been bothering me for years, or this thing that happened to me several days ago. When in fact, God has given us this location, this place, this time to deal with. If we want to try and live a life of purpose, if we want not to miss the opportunities that we have, we've got to try and always be living here and living now, being aware of what God is putting in front of us. Because there will be the time when Christ returns, just like the bridegroom, and maybe we didn't see it coming, and it will be a surprise, and there will be shouting and celebrating, and all the things we were singing there in that song earlier about the clouds being rolled back as a scroll, and the trump will resound, and the Lord will descend. I mean, I love all the imagery of that psalm. That's going to happen at some point, and we're not going to be able to miss it.